Either you're swinging crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. Shit, it's hard being young from the slums, eating pots and gums, not knowing where your meal's coming from. And now the shit's getting crazier and major. Kids younger than me, they got the sky grand pages. Going out of town, blowing up. 6 months later, all the dead bodies showing up. It make me want to grab a line in the shot. But I gotta go identify the body. Damn, what happened to the summertime cookout? Every time I turn around, niggas get took out. Shit, my mama got cancer in her breast. Don't ask me why I'm motherfucking stressed. Things done changed.
Today's times, a lot of times, it's not fashionable to listen to lyrics that much anymore, but hopefully y'all follow closely. And Biggie is telling you some things about his environment there. So what were some things that stood out for you in the song? What kind of things he talked about in describing his social environment? Yes, sir.
Well, what I got from it is kind of speaking on the difference in generations from back in the day to now. Like now there's no more hand fighting, there's more like shooting.
Good, very good, very good. So he talked about, back in the days, cats were like, duke it out. Now, first type of controversy or conflict, people are ready to shoot it out very quick. Very good. What's your name, bro?
Aaron.
Aaron, for sure. How about you, young lady? What says you?
He said how either they're going to jump shot or set a crack.
Good. Very good. So he says, the streets is a short shot. Either you sell a crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot, which is what he's saying that, in his community, Westside Brooklyn, those are the ways that people see as an escape. That in order for you to get money, you better be really, really good at basketball, or you better, be able to push some crack and everything. And this is true, but is this just true in Brooklyn? No, so this is true in many communities, throughout this country. What else stood out for you? Yes, ma'am. Good, very good observation. What's your name, Ellen?
Yes.
Yes, all right. So he talks about how, now, parents are, so freaked out to discipline their children. They're even scared of them as well. They have to call, the state to help them maintain. Very good. Yes, sir.
One beneath the actual song, I was listening to the sample of me.
Nice.
It was, I'm not sure if it was a sample from the 70s or the 80s, but it was basically talking about back in the day how they didn't talk about production like that. And it was a very big contrast with the kids there, so he was on.
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's actually a sample from a Dr. Dre and Snoop song. Related to that and everything, but it's an interesting, that you still noted that sample because a lot of you all heard of the West Coast East Coast beef, which really has started in many ways was centered around Biggie Smalls. And you get the sense that there was all this hostility, but yet he sampled Dre and Snoop, who were pretty much down to the West Coast at the time. So that's a good observation as well. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I know mentioned 1993 was born, so about 20 years from now, from then.
Y'all took a couple years after me. Go ahead.
It's still going on, talking about projects, once in the hallway, much of that stuff is still going on today.
Very good, very good. So good. So noticing the time period and everything is very important. And he's describing to you what's going on in the social environment at this time. And what's your name? LaShondra?
Yeah.
So right, so these things are very much still continuing on to this day. Absolutely. Anything else stood out in the song for you? And definitely, so this album is the song is featured from an album called Radiating It Down, where I think in many ways kind of gave me the emphasis to go into sociology, because what Biggie Smalls is doing is what we do in the discipline of sociology all the time. He's describing what's going on in society. And it's social because, as you all alluded to, this isn't just happening in Brooklyn, this isn't just happening in West Philadelphia, this isn't just happening in South Central Los Angeles. These type of things are happening in black communities all across the country. And Biggie does a job of describing these things in a way that a lot of times you don't see when you're looking at the news, when you're looking at academic texts and things like that. So he's describing how society works and the choices that he has within that society. He's using what we call in sociology, the sociological perspective. And most everybody, particularly I think many black people in America, use this all the time. So the sociological perspective refers to the ability to both participate in social life and step back and analyze the broader meanings of what's going on. So today, you all are in college. This is very different than a lot of the choices you may have made in 1960 or 1950. Why? What's changed in society to make it where so many people are going to college today? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Well, back in the day, college necessarily wasn't the only way out, and now college education is the only way to do something.
Good, very good. So back in the 1950s, 40s, 30s, you could go work for a factory and make really nice money. You didn't have to invest all this time in school, invest all this money in school. Hopefully all of you all are very devoted scholars, but I'm sure you know some people who are going to school but they don't really even like school. And it's because of what's required in society. This young lady said, what's your name, miss? As Ajane said, it is very, very difficult to move up economically in this country today without a college degree. And increasingly, multiple degrees. So I hope many of you are planning to go to grad school as well. So what you all are doing in making a choice to be here is using a sociological perspective, also referred to as a sociological imagination. The ability to both participate in social life and step back and analyze the broader meanings of what's going on. Related to this are two concepts: society and social location. Society is people who share a culture and territory. So the United States is a society. Again, we'll talk about culture and territories in a moment. So different from cultures where you have a lot of different cultures in American society. You have Chinese Americans, African Americans, Jamaican Americans, etc. But all of us form a society because we share a common culture as well as a territory. Another concept, again, connected to this, social location, the group memberships that people have because of their location and history in society. So on a basic level, how is your life different in this country if you're a boy or a girl? How are your choices different? How are your behaviors different? Yes, sir. Tell me your name again, bro. Chris, go ahead.
Well, if you're a male in today's society, you're seen you have to step forward, take charge, show that you're responsible. If you're a woman, kind of the same, where you're expected to grow up and be an example role model. However, you're not supposed to act as a girl, you're supposed to be more accepted.
Okay, good, good. So there, we have prescribed behaviors that are considered feminine and masculine. What else? What are some other things that we associate with maleness or femininity in this society? Yes, ma'am.
Well, good dress, how we dress, what we should wear, what we shouldn't wear,
Good.
female and
Good. So, and again, these things are changing these days, but generally, we'll expect women to wear heels, men to wear suits. We'll expect for women to cross their legs and sit ladylike. A dude, can sit it's not as socially too much of a social taboo for a dude to sit with his legs open, for him to burp or a fart or something like that. And I'm going to go through this, so don't feel like you have to write all this stuff down. I'll email the lecture to Dr. Mrs. Parker Walden, soon to be Dr. Parker Walden, so you'll have all this stuff, so don't feel like you have to write down everything. When we talk about sociology, this is a concept that we hear a lot of times, but it's not always clearly understood. This refers to the scientific study of human society and human behavior in the many groups that make up a society. So there are many different social sciences. Anthropology. Anybody familiar with anthropology and what they do? Yes, ma'am. Related. Good. Anybody else? It's mainly the study. What's your name?
Yes.
Yes, and so it's mainly the study of ancient cultures. Why would that be important for us to want to know how people lived 500 to 1,000 years ago? Why does that matter? Yes, sir. What's your name, bro?
Antonio.
Antonio?
It's important to study past trends and see if they come back around.
Good. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Your history, go forward with your future.
Absolutely. So if we can see, for example, what were some of the things that caused ancient Rome empire to fall? Then it might be helpful for us in this society, in this modern empire, to maybe not repeat some of those things. So, say for example, trying to go and conquer the world by spreading wars all over the place, not educating your public, eradicating the middle class. Those are all some of the things that undid ancient Rome. So it might be beneficial to know those kind of things. Economics. I don't have to tell y'all why this is important, right? So economics, being able to understand, what are going to be the economic trends in the future, both in terms of a micro level and a macro level. What will happen to a society if we get to 15% unemployment? What will happen if inflation gets to a certain level? Political science, being able to, and keep in mind, all of these things is a science in terms of scientific study of human behavior. We've heard of the natural sciences with biology, chemistry, and the like, where if we can diagnose what's causing cancer maybe we can do some things to limit it. So the same way, if we can understand some things that are harming us as humans, maybe we can be able to curb against those, or be able to better strengthen ourselves going forward in the future. Political science is the same type of deal. What are some of the most effective ways to try and win elections and to try and influence people? Psychology. Any psychology majors in here? Good. So psychology. That one of the things that we have going on in recent years is we'll have like a rash of school shootings. So that's something that's been really happening over the last 20, 30 years. So one of the things that many psychologists want to study is get inside people's heads to find out why they're doing these things. So if we find out why, we can help to prevent it in the future. If we find out things like abuse, if we know we now scientifically understand the impact that child abuse have on an individual, and being able to understand those things, we can be able to improve upon those. Because I'm sure many of you are familiar with studies that show that if you abuse yourself, a lot of times you become an abusive parent as well. So it helps if we can understand these things. Sociology, we want to look beyond an individual and look at whole entire society. So rather than look at why one individual may have shot up the school, we want to look at why are these things happening in a society like the United States when we don't see this happening in Japan, we don't see this happening in the United Kingdom, we don't see these kind of things happening in France. So in this way, again, what Biggie Smalls was doing at the beginning of our discussion was using his sociological perspective and putting on his sociology hat. As many of you have many times, whether you know it or not. There are 3 goals of science. This goes whether it's the social sciences or natural sciences like chemistry or physics. There are 3 major goals. The first is to predict what happens, to explain why something happens. So we want to be able to explain why does it rain. We want to be able to explain how do people get hypertension. What type of things cause heart disease? What kind of things are linked to ovarian cancer? We want to be able to explain why people will have random gun shootings. So to be able to scientifically explain why something happens. But we want to be able to generalize why something happens. So one of the things that is really a focus of sociologists and criminologists is why do people commit crimes? Why do you think people commit crimes? Why? Why do people commit crimes? Yes, ma'am.
I believe there's always a different story, and all we hear is the crime that's done. So I know my hometown, which rated as one of the top crime cases, is a lot of people don't have jobs, so they don't have money to feed their children. So if they are committing crimes and selling drugs, violence in the family, or so on and so forth.
Good, very good, very good. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir, Aaron?
Yeah, basically, just to obtain a need or a want, whether it's just selfishly or
Okay, good, very good. Antonio?
They don't have anything to do?
Okay, good, good. So idle time is like the devil's playground, they say. So, I'm sorry, yes, ma'am?
It can also be like out of an act of anger. Like if something going on, you just want to act out of spite or something, or do something violent.
Good, very good, very good. So what you all are doing is composing theories of why people commit crimes. Again, if we can understand why people committing crimes, then we can help to prevent crime to keep the community safe, and also it helps our economy to lock people up. But we want to be able to generalize. So you all talked about that people will do it because they don't have jobs. What about pedophiles? Are they committing that crime because they don't have jobs? What about rapists? So we want to think, so we want to be able to generalize, because there are some crimes that are not related to economic needs. So those theories still hold weight, but we want to be able to explain as much as possible. So we want to be able to explain things like why more women attending college than men? What temperature will precipitation turn to snow? This is important because it needs to be consistent. That as long as there are always anomalies, there are exceptions to the rule. But we know that consistently, that when it gets 31 degrees, precipitation is going to turn to snow. We can say consistently that when your body temperature gets above 98.6, some things are consistently going to happen to your body. You're going to display certain symptoms. So we can generalize. It's not going to be a situation where one thing happens to this young lady, one thing happens to this young lady, one thing happens to another. No, we can generalize across the board what's going to happen. Third, we want to predict what will happen in the future. What will happen if unemployment hits 20%? What will happen if gun laws will change in New York? How will laws change as more minorities are elected to public office? What will happen if children are reading at grade level by age 10? Anybody want to take a gander at what happens? Or what fourth grade reading scores help to determine the terms of our economy? This is what they use to determine the number of prisons that we build in this country. So economists will look at the rate of fourth grade reading levels, and they'll say, okay, look, we need to build X amount of prisons for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Because oftentimes you've seen that if you're behind at this stage, then it's going to be, you're pretty much going to be stuck in the game going forward. And if you don't have education in this country, Biggie Smalls already told you what the options are. So we can predict safely that if, X amount of children are not up to par at this stage, we can predict what's going to happen later on. And most importantly, we want to move beyond common sense and being able to explain things scientifically, specifically social scientific. So, the Age of Enlightenment, anybody familiar with this period of history, the Age of Enlightenment? What happened here? What happened during the Age of Enlightenment? Yes, ma'am.
They did a lot of experiments on the body. I think the time frame was in the 1600s, around that time frame.
Good. What else? Antonio?
They basically moved away from the religion part of it and started explaining it.
Good. So you've heard these things like the world is flat. It was believed that the Earth and the other planets didn't revolve around the sun, that everything revolved around the Earth. And these things, so Galileo, who was one of the people that really began to, argue against a lot of these contentions and everything, he couldn't even, speak this because the Catholic Church at the time felt that these, ideas were forbidden. And this didn't mean, God was here to totally out of the picture, but we didn't just use, God alone to be able to explain things and superstition. So a lot of times people will hold on to certain beliefs because that's what people always believe. So they always believe that women aren't supposed to work because God said that women are only supposed to bear children. Well, now we say, with the Enlightenment, let's test it out. Let's have a man and a woman do the same type of work and see who does it better. As opposed to just relying on the tradition. The Asian Revolution is coupled with this, where we begin to question the way that society has been constructed. So again, the church many times will say that if you were born poor, it's because God wanted you to be poor. If you were born a slave, it's because God wanted you to be a slave. So in this way, people begin to question, and so it's very revolutionary at the time, people begin to question the way that these things were set up, where the divine right of kings, for example, held that I was a king because God wanted me to be the king. So now we begin to test and again, change the way society has been developed for, thousands and thousands of years in some cases. So again, as Antonio talked about, most of our ideas were based on superstitions and myths. So it was believed for a time that twins were a curse from God. Again, right, we talk about now, today, we can explain why scientific exceptions happen. Usually when you procreate, you're going to produce one baby at a time. But scientifically, we know that sometimes you have twins. Back then, before that, you know what they would do if you had twins? They're going to kill them because this must be some type of devil child. Again, if you can't explain it scientifically, I know it probably was pretty freaked out. You expect it to be like, oh shit, it's two of them? So they're thinking this is something like some type of curse. So they would kill the twins as a result. They would believe that the short brain babies. And again, do a Google search if you anybody get up on this, but it's not destructive to produce those babies. Anybody know where that myth came from? So very quickly, the storks in Europe, they would appear in the springtime. And that's a lot of time when babies will be born. So they figured that the storks were the ones that were bringing the babies. However, when it's cold in winter, whether it be 2013 or whether it be 513, what are some activities that people might engage in when it's real cold outside? So, still today, 2013, you know when most babies are produced? Right about now. So be careful, fellas. It was believed that God didn't intend for women to go to school. It was believed that black people committed crimes because they have smaller skulls. So now today, scientifically, we can prove that all these things are totally false. But we can't go off just common sense and our own isolated observations. So we need to use a scientific method and use an objective systemic observation to test theories. So we talked about why there are so many gun deaths in America today. So one theory is that it's the violent video games and things like that our children are exposed to. What do you all think this plays in the level of violence that we have in America? Do you think it plays any role at all? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think it kind of is true to a certain extent because the more video games come out, the more real they become. So if a video game is played over and over again, it's gonna get in their mind yes, this is real, and I can do this. I can actually do it.
Okay, good, very good. Yes, ma'am.
When kids play video games, they kind of think it's more reality. So they take from what they get off video games and use them in real life. So they can be Like say it's a shooting game like Call of Duty. A kid can interpret Call of Duty and go out and do all type of stuff, but it's because they was like, they partook in playing video games, like in a violent manner anyway.
Absolutely, very good, very good. Yes, ma'am?
I think it does play a part in also the younger the child is playing video games.
Mm-hmm.
Because most video games have age restrictions, if you remember, like you're supposed to use it after 18 or 17 or something like that, which where you're already developed. But a lot of kids are playing these games at like 8 and 7, and so they're like growing up with this, like thinking that it's okay, and that's where I think it kind of plays a part.
Oh, sir. Christine Antonio.
I think Columbine happened in 90, right?
Yeah, I'll take 99 style.
Yeah, the games back then, they weren't that realistic during the graphics. And according to things they said about a lot of people that did, they weren't really into video games. They were more into heavy metal and everything like that. So video games pretty much didn't even have a say in what happened at Columbine. So I don't feel that video games contribute to the whole school shooting stuff.
Okay, good, very good. Antonio?
I would say.
What is your name, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that like Chris was saying, it was true back then that video games were really that violent, but this day and age, video games are a lot more violent.
Mhm.
But I would say that would be like a small portion only because if you dig down deeper, maybe that person had something genetically already inside of the brought the video game brought about. It could be a small catalyst.
Okay, very good, very good. All very, very, very good answers and response and everything. Keep in mind, though, that when we're talking about science, one of the things we want to do, we want to be able to generalize and say that this is generally true. So, with this in mind, these video games are like we talked about. Do they play these games in Japan? What about France? Germany? United Kingdom? How come they kids don't be going and shooting up everybody? So there's something different about this particular society, because those games are everywhere, but you don't see people behaving in the same manner. So the main reason why we have more of these kind of like episodes in America is that because in America, no place in the world can you more easily get a gun. Like that's like, so now this doesn't mean that violent video games doesn't play a role. They do. So the video games, the music, all those things can play a factor. But the largest factor is the access to guns we have. That you can get a gun sometimes, easier than you can like, medical service in America. So we can't just go off of like, opinion. We want to be careful, like, so Chris's point about Columbine was very instructive. So we can get informed by episodes like that, but we want to gather as much data as possible. So if we want to look at school shooters, we definitely want to look at Columbine, but we want to look at as many school shooters as possible to see if any common patterns emerge. So the same way, like, if you're trying to diagnose what's causing a high risk of cancer in America in the last 30 years, you don't want to just look at one person, right? You want to look at as many different cases as possible. You want to look at old people, you want to look at young people, you want to look at black women, Asian women, everything, middle class, upper class. So you want to get as much data as possible. Although, do your research on this, the anecdote that Rick gave was totally fictitious. Or I won't say totally fictitious, it was exaggerated. Do your research on that. But the point being is that he tried to make it a point that as white America began to suffer more economically, the reason why is because all these poor black people are draining all the resources. Even though, again, do your research on this, welfare benefits make up a very, 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 very small portion of our federal budget and everything. Like we give more money, for example, to billionaire oil companies than we do to single black women. And the average, although the majority rates on welfare is what? White in America. Do your own research, but that is the fact. So we talked about culture again. The language, beliefs, values, norms, behaviors that are passed down from one generation to the next. We talked about subculture. Values and related behaviors of a group that distinguishes members from the larger mainstream culture. So the subculture that's been most appealing to me and that I did my dissertation research on was hip-hop subculture. It's both defined by its differences and similarities within mainstream U.S. culture. We usually only hear about rapping, great poets like Biggie Smalls, for example, but there are 4 elements of hip-hop culture. Rapping, DJing, graffiti, and b-boying, more commonly referred to as breakdancing. Understanding Reaganomics and specifically supply-side economics is very important to understanding hip-hop. Anybody familiar with supply-side economics, probably more commonly referred to as Reaganomics. Anybody heard of this concept before? The basic notion of Reaganomics is very quickly is that if we make things easier for the rich people, if we tax them less, then the money that the rich people save is going to magically trickle down to all the middle class and poor people. So the key to stimulating our economy is to make it easier for the rich people, because if they pay too many taxes, they're not going to hire people, they're not going to invest back in the economy. So the way to make everybody rich is to get things better for rich people. This meant that a lot of programs that the government was spending money on had to be cut. Most notably school systems and our programs in New York City. So, and this is important where if a kid is doing bad in math, the kid isn't that good in English, but like he plays the piano really well, or like, he has some type of artistic talent, that could be enough to keep him in school until he can get his focus and discipline. And if nothing else, just keep Shorty from off the street. But these things begin to get cut in New York City because whenever America gets into a budget crisis, the first thing that gets cut is money for poor people, and usually poor people of color specific. It's also, again, the recreation in New York, the disco music and clubs and everything like Studio 54 was promote upper class value system. So it'd be a situation where you go to Studio 54 and they would like come outside, like it'd be hundreds of people in line, and they would look and say, okay, yeah, you can get in, okay, you can get in, hell no, you can't get in. So it would be very status worthy thing. So if you weren't important to somebody, you wouldn't be able to have access to it. And it's also important to understand that New York City is one of the most multicultural and diverse cities in the whole world. So you have a lot of different cultures like blended in to form the creation of hip hop, but none more so than African Americans. So this is important, again, where it gave black people a certain level of freedom. So be able to express ideas that couldn't be really expressed in mainstream culture. And it gave us you talked about family earlier and the collectivism. So black people by our nature, and African cultures are not individualistic. And again, you can speak to this better than me, where it's not just, you've heard the term, for example, it takes a village to raise a child, African proverb for that, where we are about the community. That if you're not straight, I'm not straight. It's not enough okay, look, I quote unquote made it, I'm economically successful, but all my people not good, that's not cool. So that's something again, in American context, okay, look, I got mine, fuck the rest of y'all. This is about individualism. That's not how African culture behaved before, again, they interacted with Europeans. So in this way, again, it was very different. The performance itself of rap was very different in terms of the structure of the song, the way that the interaction within the songs as well. Where if you go see somebody performing in Bach or Mozart or something like that, a classical performance, you have the musicians sit up, everybody's really quiet, and you politely clap after the performance is done. In a black performance, it's expected that you interact during the performance. This is whether it's you're rocking out to the gospel on Sundays, or whether or not you're at a hip hop concert. If you go to a rap concert and you're just sitting there quietly, they can what's going on. The artist needs your energy, so it's a collective, give and take experience. The pioneers of hip hop culture are Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash. Much like the founding fathers of the United States, these pioneers helped to define the value system of hip hop culture. Some of the things that are part of hip hop culture is collective individuality, where again, nothing in the world is worse than being a biter or trying to be like somebody else. So you want to have some sense of individuality, but your individuality is related in some larger context. So that's why a lot of times, if you hear a rapper get on, they'll be shouting out their city and stuff like that. So Biggie was not just a success story for him, he represented for all of Brooklyn. So same thing when you would hear cats like Outkast when they first came out of Atlanta, hip hop is a working class culture. Today when you see all these cats balling out and talking about how much diamonds and ice they got, that's not something that's consistent with where the culture came from. Hip hop was started by poor people. So it always is supposed to reflect the values of the communities that we came from. But it also again, this didn't mean we wanted to stay poor. It was all about trying to become more successful, but also become more successful and go and get other people. So we have inclusive capitalism. Not Reaganomics, where we only wanted to reward certain people in capitalism. This form of capitalism wants to include everybody. There's respect for the past, and uncompromising free speech, where even if you don't like what people have to say, we're gonna say it no matter what. That we're not gonna try and water down or filter anything we have to say. Today, hip hop in many ways has drifted from a lot of these founding values. Blacks in America, and hip hop is important to a black experience because, as we talked about, black people in America had their culture strategically stripped away from them. This required where black culture became a bastardized and inferior form of white culture. So most of the times, what we see posing as black culture is us trying to behave like Europeans and oftentimes failing miserably at it. although hip hop is not at all a replacement from our, for our cultural norms from Africa, it did allow value system to differ dramatically from the one that rejected blacks for generations. Because again, even like the likes of Barack Obama has not been accepted by the mainstream in this country in many lights. So the hip hop generation began to feel like, you know what? Fuck you and your acceptance. Like, we're not even trying to win approval from you whatsoever. Hip hop allowed blacks also to be framed from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness or victimology. Hip hop gave blacks a space where we can define ourselves on our own terms. So again, we talked about African culture, where if you ever go to like an African performance, like African dance in particular, like you probably aren't going to be allowed to just sit there very long. At some point, they probably going to pull you in and have you come up there and get down with it. So again, the same thing, the call and response that you see like within African cultures, still is like true in hip hop culture. Anybody familiar with the term the cipher? What's the cipher? Yeah, so generally, when people are freestyling, they'll be in a cipher, meaning they'll be in a circle. Sometimes, and do your research on this, people do other things in a circle sometimes too. That's neither here nor there. But this comes from this stems from Africa, where again, most of the times when the performance are done, it'll be done in a circle. You all supposed to be again bonding together collectively. And if and there are certain rules for the cipher. Griots were African, again, like most of European culture involved written text, where things can be written down and passed down. African culture works very much, it's a very oral tradition, where stories and messages be passed down orally. So the griots will be the people in the culture that were responsible for that, much like the hip hop artists are today. So Biggie Smalls was serving as a griot. He's telling you, hey, this is what life was like in 1993. And hip hop allowed, again, for the telling of many stories that weren't given a form in media or the school system. Many people look at Biggie Smalls' story like, oh my God, that's horrible. Like, listen to all these horrible things he's saying. He's documented what was going on. Now, whether or not you like that or not, that's up to you, the listener. Whether or not you judge this as positive or negative, that's up to each individual listener. But these things are still happening, whether or not, he describes it this way or not. So it was the first time where you would have these kind of stories told in just unadulterated formats. White culture, so we talked about culture, an important thing as I get ready to conclude here, is related to culture, is social institutions. So institutions, because again, right, the best way is for you to learn your culture through your family. So you'll learn through your family, what type of foods you're supposed to eat. So you'll learn, the different folk songs amongst Irish culture, things like that, different styles of dress, different dances that are familiar with Irish culture. You may learn, what type of behavior you're supposed to engage in on the Sabbath if you're a Jewish person. You'll learn what the norms are for dating if you're a Chinese girl. You learn a lot of those from your family, but you learn many of these things through social institutions, schools, churches, and the like. So connected to this is a concept called cultural capital. Very quickly, cultural capital. So in addition, capital in a general sense is what you money that you can use to get some service or some other resource. Cultural capital is knowledge, skills, education that help promote social mobility beyond just economic capital. You usually can't buy this. It can only be acquired in specific social circles. It can be accessed with cultural capital. So if you have knowledge of certain museums and things like that, for example, that might be impressive amongst the upper class social circles. If you know the proper utensils and everything to eat at a dinner party, that's part of cultural capital that can allow you to again get in other social circles. If you know how to golf and you can go out with the good old boys at your corporate office and everything. So these are all elements of cultural capital. Things that again, our money and of themselves can help you get money. Pierre Bourdieu, who came up with this term, identified 3 forms of cultural capital. The first, and this is related to culture. So in this way, again, keep in mind when we talk about hip hop, it's a subculture. So there are these 3 forms of cultural capital are very much relevant to hip hop. So embodied capital. This describes how the values of a given culture are internalized within the individual identities of the members of the culture. So a lot of times today, right, people fake being hip hop. So you just have a certain dialect. Yeah, what's up, son? So I'm hip hop now, right? Because I use a certain dialect because my mannerisms are a certain way. But most importantly, having cultural competence, so again, particularly as it relates to objectified cultural capital, where you can buy an artifact. So just because you buy sushi does not mean that you're now part of Japanese culture. You have bought something that's from Japanese culture. So the same way, right, Because, you know, some white kid in Nebraska buys, like, you know, a rap CD, is he now all of a sudden hip-hop? No, not if he hasn't lived and internalized the dialect, the mannerisms, and the things that are relevant to this culture. This doesn't mean that white kids can't be hip-hop, not at all. But you actually have to, like, you know, pay your dues and get your hands dirty. You can't get it just by buying something. Connected to this is institutionalized capital. So this serves as the legitimizing force. So university, for example, provide us cultural capital. One of the things we want to think about as relates to hip-hop, what institutions control hip-hop culture? What institutions control hip-hop culture in your opinion? And spreading the values and establishing what's normal and establishing what's good or bad in hip-hop. What institutions are responsible for that? Antonio. Neil Simon. Good. Media. Good. Sorry. The church. Okay. Good. 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 Yes, ma'am. Regulators. Good. What values do these out there?
Government.
Good. Okay. Good. What values? Again, good, bad, norms, standards. What values are promoted by these institutions? What kind of, like, so when you get the messages that are disseminated from these institutions, what kind of values are they promoting? I'm sorry, Chris.
In terms of record label, it could be seen as a positive or negative. If you're against the state's record label, you lose your creativity, your ingenuity, and everything. But if you're you're basically going against it, then you're trying to break out from the record label, you're trying to be on your own, there's no creativity, you got to stop making what the record label is.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's make a generalization though. In general, because you're right, there are definitely many exceptions out here, no question. In general, what kind of values do you feel are promoted? Good. You stretching for or you rest? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Pretty much in today's culture, getting money.
So good. So getting money. Good. What else? It's fair. I'm sorry. What else values are promoted? Yes, Erica?
Now you're starting to see example on BET, which is mainly, in my opinion, one of our main source of media that, you know, put out what we do as black people. Now they're starting to advocate for Black Girls Rock. You're starting to see a lot of different organizations. And now it's Oprah. Now she doesn't have her own talk show from BET. She has owned. She's like opening the doors up for a lot of black entrepreneurs to start their own company. Now you're starting to see shows such as Atlanta Housewives. And you have a lot of other shows like Orange County. These women aren't even black. They're starting to come up and, you know, put themselves on the map about what they do within their home and community.
No, absolutely. Did you have a comment on this? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's like anti-straight black women as
Good. So the portrayal of black women is like oftentimes like, you know, it's very negative. Again, I did some research and talked about that. Basically when black women are featured like in videos and everything, like they're generally like half naked, they're like, you know, they're very much sexualized and things like that. So if you come from another community or another culture, you're not exposed to black people because we live in a very segregated society. So a lot of times your only information that you get about black people is through the TV. And if you're seeing that, then you think like, oh my God, look at some of these black women and black men. So like, you know, we're all thugs and things like that. And again, this doesn't mean like, you know, that the thug images shouldn't be shown because that's part of our reality. But that's not all of our reality. You know, so we have many different like, you know, types of black people in our community, but only certain types of black people get on TV. Mike Moore says that this is because record labels are the gatekeepers of hip-hop industry. Labels determine not only which artists and scientists Chris spoke to, but what message reaches the people. In other words, it's counting the relatively small voice of underground artists. Record labels have a monopoly on the distribution of cultural imagery. And these corporations, not so much that they hate black people, more of it is that they like money. So whatever they feel is profitable, they're going to produce. So in this way, if they feel like talking like, you know, images about, you know, how black women were the queen of the universe, and they feel like that would sell, they might promote it more. So one of the things that I want us to walk away from here from is, what role do we play in this process? Because capitalism, again, like, you know, works on like, you know, supply and demand. So if there's hot garbage or something being produced out here, you know, be careful and mindful of what you buy. I contend that the gatekeepers of the industry I refer to as a rap industrial complex. These corporations are only interested in the profit-making components of hip-hop. They're not interested in the culture of hip-hop. They're interested in making money off of hip-hop. Not all forms of hip-hop expression are viewed as profitable. These decisions, in terms of like what goes out to the public, are not made by like, you know, people immersed in the culture. So we talked about institutions like Jewish institutions, Italian institutions. Those are usually going to be ran by somebody who's immersed and sympathetic to the culture. Our culture oftentimes, are ran by people who don't possess the embodied capital, that they haven't lived and experienced or have any kind of connection with the culture. A lot of these people actually hate hip hop and hate black people, but they get in control of, like, you know, our image makers. And in true stuff, the hip hop value system leads to a blurring of the rules. My question for you before we leave today: are there any ramifications for society at large for this shift in our in the subculture of hip hop, or is it just entertainment? Is it just music, or does it have any kind of meaning beyond just music? And you know that if you listen to, like, you know, Soulja Boy talking about, you know, nothing on chicks and everything, that's just entertainment, right? No harm to that. Because that is like when we talked about Super Soaking at Home, that's what he was talking about. Right, I know we don't usually listen, we just listen to the beat, so, but yes, that's what he's talking about. While the black queens, mothers of civilization, are shaking their considerable asses too. Listen to what you're consuming. So do you think that this has any kind of ramifications, or is it just music? How so?
A lot of ways, because a lot of people think that these things are okay. Like a lot of females call themselves like that on a bad beat, and like that's not necessarily a good thing. Like, why would you want to be called a B-word? It's something stupid, and just because you're bad, it's supposed to be like you're cute or you're this or that, but that's not what you want to be. You want to be independent, or you want to be this. But females think that that's okay because that's what men are looking for, and that's what they see. And other things, like men think that it's okay to just have a lot of money and have a lot of cars, but if you only have that for a year, and then next year you're broke, then you're not successful. So I feel like it does have an effect because people look up to the individuals and think that it's okay to be fine.
Very good. Yes, ma'am, what's your name?
Brittany.
Brittany, go ahead.
It also has a negative effect because other cultures think that all black people do, all black women do is shake their butt in videos and do certain things for money, and if that only thing black people do is sell drugs, like they don't really see the successful black people, so they think that.
Absolutely, like there's no reason why, like, I mean, because this here is part of the black experience. There's no reason why you can't have something like this, like in a big. When I was coming up, they would show videos like of people like going to college and stuff like that. You know, so there's no reason why you can't show that aspect of the black experience as well. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Marcus.
Marcus, go ahead.
Also, it's not just music, it influences our society, not only from the music side, but also how they portray our music and how they portray our culture in the media. Because, I mean, even towards us, we see Jay-Z, we see everybody got these, even if they ain't rocking the chains, but we know they got money. And you see that they working hard for their money, but at the same time, it's a big stack of money that seems that they're acquired in a short amount of time. So we want that fast money too.
Very good.
Which is why people are attracted, which is why, not in all cases, but in most cases, our youth are attracted to the street because we want quick money. We want money right now that we can hold ourselves in our hands.
Excellent. Excellent. Right. So I'm not going to blame the 50% dropout rate strictly on, like, you know, Jay-Z and others per se. But I think to your point that yes, in a lot of cats, what you all doing now takes a lot of patience and discipline. That you are putting off making immediate money to make bigger money, like, you know, 4 or 5 years from now and everything. That takes a lot of, like, you know, sacrifice. So it's easier, like, you know, to, like, want quick money. I wanted quick money too, you know, but I didn't want to end up. I'm too little to be going to jail. So yes, ma'am.
I was gonna say, one, lots of respect. Back in the day, you wouldn't walk around and curse around your mother, your grandmother. So I think a lot of that has a lot to do with why they cussing us women out, because lots of respect.
Good, good. So right, so when you see it, like, you know, just like that it's okay to W.B. Du Bois and Philadelphia Negro, well, he basically went out and did like survey research where, say for example, today, as it was then, the infant mortality rate in the black community is much higher than it is in the rest of the neighboring communities across the country. Infant mortality is the number of babies that die within their first year of birth. So in Harlem, New York, for example, it's like on par with what you'll find like in Bangladesh or some shit like that, just totally crazy. So one of the things that the boys wanted to do is find out what's going on in that neighborhood to make it where this neighborhood over here, you have high infant mortality. This community over here, you know, you don't see these same numbers in race and everything. And across the board, you found, like, you know, economics was the biggest determinant. So in this way, again, to be able to scientifically study things to make larger social conclusions. The Chicago School in Human Ecology was one of the first, like, really took hold of this, where they went and studied how people live in their everyday lives. So when we talk about, again, we talked about societies before. These are populations, again, that share geographic territory and carry out the major functions of life. Related to it is culture. Culture is the language, beliefs, values, norms, behaviors, and even material objects that are passed down from one generation to the next. So again, so America, right, is like, consists of a culture. So the language here where you can come from Italy, you can come from Mexico, you can come from China. But if you want to be able to assimilate and get have full range of opportunities in the society, you're going to have to adapt the language. What are some beliefs, some things that in America that we believe that are unique and different from other parts of the world? Has anybody had a chance to travel a little bit at all? And I highly recommend that you do that if you're having an exchange program. It's quite educational. But what are some things that are unique about American society and culture? Yes, ma'am. What's your name? Yachi. No worries.
But I know that one thing I noticed is because I'm African from Nigeria, and one big thing that is different about an American society, American culture, it's kind of okay for children to leave home around a young age, usually age 18. They kind of be adults, but usually in other cultures in different countries, it's usually that you stay with your parents until you find your mate and then you move on to their house.
Great example, great example. So we believe in this country that when you become 18, that you're supposed to be a legal adult and supposed to go strike out on your own and be quote unquote independent. The example you gave is actually more common. The way we do it is actually very unique. Where again, so we're a very individualistic culture where people are expected to strike out on their own. Most cultures across the world, the family unit is very, very important. So you'll see in some cultures things like that, and some Asian cultures, Hispanic cultures, you may have 3 generations of cats living in one household. Where here it'll be expected that each person will invest $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 to live in their own separate houses. Something like fast food is something that's unique here, where in most countries you're expected to sit down and have a meal. Only civilized people will eat walking around and then they tire and stuff like that. So they look at us like we're crazy and everything. No, you're supposed to sit and take your time. In some cultures like Spain, for example, when lunchtime comes around, everything is shut down because again you're supposed to chill and take your time. Here we're supposed to work hard and kill all the time. What are some of the Antonio?
Like you were saying, Spain, they sit down and lunch. Here, our biggest meal is dinner.
Mm-hmm.
In other countries, their biggest meal is their breakfast and lunch.
Absolutely.
Everything is reversed.
Very good, very good. Yes, definitely, again, America is very, very unique. A lot of times we go across the world, people be looking at us like we're crazy and call us
Please leave my
ugly Americans. What are some American values? What are some things, when we talk about values, things that we think are important, how we, the standards that we set for what's good or bad, standards for beauty. So what are some things that we value in America? And no, that's not an oxymoron. What are some American values? What are some things that we really hold true and important and almost are quintessential to make you an American? Chris? Good, very good. Be more specific. What is the standard of beauty in America? Very good.
The standard of beauty in America is you have to have, I know that the ratio of 7:10, if you have a ratio of 7:10 face where your eyes, your mouth, and your nose, 7:10 is part of your face, you consider beautiful. And that plays into you working your career and everything because statistically, an attractive person will get a better job versus an ugly person.
Man, I'm gonna see some trouble. Good. Yes, ma'am. Very good, Chris. What's your name?
Erica.
Good.
It's more so now, some people would say a bachelor's degree is equivalent to a college diploma, and now it's it's vital to go in there and further your education because those who set themselves and their family members, parents, grandparents who have set them on the pedestal to further their education, it puts us at a higher market to get a job because for them back then, you even said it earlier, it was easier for them to not attend college and work in a textile factory and get paid just as much as a professor did at that time.
Absolutely.
Now, it's not like that.
Absolutely, very good. So education is a value. It's different where in some countries and everything, if you live in in a fishing village or something like that, the skills that you need to learn how to fish are going to be more important, more valued than learning the latest computer program. So good. So education is a very important value. What else are some values in American society? Yes, ma'am. Good. Very good, very good. So we're very materialistic in terms of we put a lot of value on things in this country. Very good, very good. Any other American values? Yes, ma'am.
To piggyback off of her and her grandparents or the grandparents because of old money and who you know and instead of what you know is not.
Good, very good. And what's important with this, right, is that these things are passed from one generation to the next. So most of these things are going to be valued by the next generation, the generation after that. So again, in Japanese culture, it'll be expected that when your parents get old, they're coming to live with you, G. In our society, they look down upon us because we have nursing homes and things like that. Like, how could you put your parents in a nursing home? But in our society, things cost so much more money. It's hard enough taking care of yourself half the time. Where it takes a lot to to be a caregiver for an older parent. Like my auntie, like when my grandmother was passing away, she had to do that, and that's a lot of responsibility. So the nursing home is a reflection of our culture, not necessarily that we're just horrible people. But if we lived in Japan, it would be expected that people would down upon us if we ever did something like that. And I think some of this is true, like in the black community as well, where we do kind of like look down upon nursing homes like different from other races. But I also think a lot of it is economic as well. So there are two aspects of culture: material and non-material culture. Material, these are things you can touch and feel. Objects will distinguish a group of people. So you've seen like Asian art, African art, and the like. Different utensils, so whether or not you use chopsticks, whether or not you use a fork, hairstyles, clothing. Non-material culture involves your way of thinking. So your beliefs, your values. So whether or not you believe education is important, whether or not you believe that women should not drive like they do in Saudi Arabia, whether or not you believe that children are supposed to be very submissive like they do like in many Asian cultures, where speaking out and speaking back, even when you're an adult. Like, your parents can come into your house and still tell you what to do in many of these cultures and everything. Where here, like I love my mom to death, but, she can't be coming to my crib like, hey, do this and do that and everything. So this is because of the culture that I've been raised in. We would all behave and believe very different things if we were immersed in a different culture. So, again, as we talked about, our culture is taken for granted. So we think that it's natural for us to wear blue jeans, to drive on the right side of the road. Our culture provides instruction on what we ought to do and how we ought to think. So, for example, you'd be considered rude if you don't remove your shoes when eating in a restaurant if you're in Japan. Where here in our culture, if you take your shoes off in a restaurant, you're going to be considered rude. So again, just being immersed in a different culture challenges our basic assumptions about life. So again, when you get a chance to travel, you'll get a chance to see just how different we Americans are. Again, values. How do we judge? How do we define what's desirable or undesirable, what's good or bad, what's appropriate, inappropriate, beautiful or ugly? So again, Chris did a wonderful job explaining that. And again, culture changes. So today, a lot of times, the model of beauty for the last, 30 years has been, super skinny, tall, blonde chick and everything who has a body like she's about 12 years old. But this hasn't always been the case in America. Like, y'all ever seen Marilyn Monroe? Like, she didn't fit that size. Back in in the 1920s and stuff, dudes were looking up for them a real big girl and stuff like that. Like, you was considered homely if you was real skinny and everything. Like, what, you ain't eating, what's wrong with you? Because that meant that you were probably very poor. So it was sexier back then to be almost like a Jennifer Hudson before, the Weight Watchers and everything. So related to that are norms. So these are expectational rules of behavior that reflect and enforce values. So, for example, democracy is a value that we value every person having a say-so in their government and how they're governed. This is not a value in all societies where they may feel like, some societies have theocracies where they feel like, the religious doctrine should determine the rules of governance. So democracy is a value, meaning that everybody should have a say-so in how they're governed. And free speech is a normal way that we express this value. So we'll see, a country that may claim that they're democratic, but if they're limiting free speech, then their norms and their values are in conflict. And these things happen a little often. We also, though, have many different subcultures. So we have the larger American culture, but we also have, in America, a lot of distinct subcultures. This isn't true in every society. In a society like Japan, for example, everybody is very, very similar. But here you have many, many different groups. So we have subcultures like Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. We can't even say Black Americans because a Jamaican cat, a Haitian cat, a black dude from Philadelphia may all have the same skin, but their culture may be very, very different. We also can break it down even further than that, where we have a hip-hop subculture, which I'll talk about momentarily. Bodybuilders, doctors, sororities and fraternities have their own subcultures. and probably even within specific, like, fraternities, like, so the Cubes will probably have a different subculture from others, different from the Catholics, and things like that. Vegans, construction workers. So in all these cases, right, there will be language that they'll use amongst each other that other people may not understand if you're not. So the same way if two Chinese people are talking with one another, you may not understand their language. If you're talking to two computer programmers and they're speaking to each other, you may not understand their language. So cultures, they have their own norms, values, and standards. We also have countercultures who they base their identity in total opposition to the mainstream culture. So the Black Panthers, polygamists, the hippies of the 1960s are some examples. So we talked about American values earlier. Some of these values include achievement and success, individualism. Again, many cultures it's about the group, but here it's about your inner. So we've heard like this debate about healthcare over the last couple of years, right? Because in America, it's all about you as an individual. That if you can't afford any healthcare with your broke ass, it's your own broke ass fault. You should have worked hard like me. If you would have been like me, you could have got healthcare. Other societies look at us and think that we're crazy because they feel like, well, everybody's going to get sick at some point, so let's take care of everybody. Because if you get a cold, or if you get something like, horrible disease and everything, then you can spread that to us. So you know what? I need you to go to a doctor immediately and get that shit cleaned up. Please. Like, here, take $10, get this stuff straightened out because it'll actually save me more money in the long run. But here, it's about the individual. Activity and work, again. In France, for example, it is illegal for you to work more than 35 hours a week. Not so in the United States where people are working 60, 80 hours a week. Because again, hard work all the time, so you can work hard till you die. Efficiency and practicality. So one of the things about, fast food and stuff like that, because some countries, they don't believe in having fast food. They try and do their best to like shut McDonald's and Burger King from coming into their communities. The reason why we need it here is because people are always on the go. So we need to do things very, very quickly here. Science and technology is very important. Progress, the things are consistently getting better. Material comfort that you had mentioned earlier. Freedom, democracy, equality, romantic love. And this is unique in that in many places across the world, like they don't get married because, they love each other. They get married because it has some type of economic benefit. Here we get married because, oh, I'm in love. I'm so passionate in love. So this is, again, is a unique American value in many ways. So we talked about the mainstream values in terms of what's important across the mainstream society. How about for black folks? What are some things that, that are some values in the black community? What are some things that are valued in the black community? Yes, ma'am. Good. So family, very good. What's your name? Kiana. Good. Yes, ma'am.
Family.
Good. So family again. Yes, sir.
Religion.
Good. Religion. Yes, very religious people. Good. And?
Parents.
Good. Appearances. We gotta stay fine. Very important. Yes, ma'am. Money. Good. Yes, sir. Say it. Good. Equality. Very good. Any other values? Any others? So, it's much debated over time and everything. There are many people who say that, this is oxymoron, and one of the reasons why African Americans, sit in the lower economic ramps in the society is because of our values, and I'll allude to that in a moment. But again, African Americans, like Italians, Jews, and Chinese Americans, make up a unique subculture. We have our own values, our own norms, different standards and everything that differ from the rest of mainstream society. So, we talked about some of these values already in terms of our African American subculture, but it's important to understand the history associated with these values. So, first of all, even though many groups have suffered at the hand of American imperialism, but no other group in history has anything that's on parallel with American blacks. Of course, as I tell my own students, do your own research on this, but it'll be very hard to compare. Slavery, many people say, okay, well, slavery ended a couple hundred years ago. What are y'all still debating about? But it continues to play a major role in spite of its eradication well over a century ago. In many ways, things have gotten a lot better over the last, 50, even last 20 years. But it's still difficult for blacks to participate fully in society. I mean, we have a black president now who is matriculated through the highest institution in this country, and his legitimacy is still being questioned. And keep in mind, the intelligence level of the previous fucking president. It's for the context. But still, he's considered it's illegitimate. But this dumbass hit, nobody wasn't questioning the same level. Blacks were chosen for chattel slavery due in large part to their unique physical characteristics. Slaves were considered property, not people. So at any moment, So, Antonio, you think that you got a wife and everything? At any moment, God, we finna take your wife and do whatever we want to with her. Matter of fact, we finna sell the wheel up the road, and there's nothing that she can do about it. Keep these kind of histories in mind when we talk about, the dynamic of the black family today. This history cannot be divorced from it. Where, from the very beginning, our family structure was not considered as legitimate. Slave rights did not allow for consistent family structure. It actually encouraged us to engage in promiscuous relationships where they would do all types of mating and things like that. Let's get this big black buck here to get with this big girl here so that we can produce us a nice fine slave. We lived in cramped, dilapidated housing. Our living conditions subjected us to malaria, yellow fever, chorea, pneumonia, and other diseases. And one of the things that we had, that emerged, and we talked about this legacy that still, lingers with us today. Again, I think this is improving. Things have gotten a lot better, to be sure. But house slaves and field slaves, do we still have any house slaves and field slaves today? Yes, we certainly do. Something that's really important in understanding, this context is a slave master by the name of Willie Lynch, and there was a famous letter that he penned a couple of hundred years ago. Anybody familiar with Willie Lynch and the Willie Lynch letter? Describe that for your classmates. What were some of the things that Mr. Lynch was speaking to here? Erica?
He pretty much wrote in that letter to how to tame the black man and the woman and how to break them down to where they're not humans anymore. Pretty much treating them as if they're animals or property is what they were viewed upon as, de-analyzing them to make them feel as if they're worth something and put it in their mind to where that, okay, your ownership of the white male superior, and whenever we say goes, and you're not valued as anything at all.
Good, very good, very good. Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Camellia.
Camellia?
He also said something about taking the father away from the family so that the son can feel weak and the female can feel higher. They want him to be strong physically but weak in the mind, and the female is strong in the mind but weak.
Very good, very good. Yes, ma'am.
He says he uses fear, disgust, and envy to control. He uses the dark skin and the light skin plays against each other. So it's something like that that's still going on today.
Good, very good. Yes, ma'am. Did you have any?
I was going to say that it basically expanded to each other, slave owners, how to slave on the slave.
Well, certainly. So they issue a step-by-step manual of how to go about controlling your slaves. And it's as some of you all have mentioned, many of these things definitely still do hold sway today without question. And in this way, again, if you could train somebody in this way to behave in a certain way, I don't have to oppress you myself. I can have you do it all yourself. And we do a pretty good job of it at times. But make no mistake, our culture did not begin when we came here, as slaves. We had a very deep and complex culture, back in Africa. Our culture, however, was systemically stripped away from us. So, in this way, for example, we were slaves. They would have, if you were Benda and you were Khoi Khoi and you were Zulu, they would make sure that you all were together. They weren't going to put you, because again, we hear Africa. But that's a very generic term. There are many different tribes and cultures within Africa. So in a place like Nigeria, for example, you have upwards of 20, 30 different ethnic groups at times. But the Europeans said, hey, y'all gonna be together, y'all gonna be out Nigeria. But coming over here and everything, they made a point to make sure that we were separated from people within our culture so that we can communicate with one another and so that we can establish rivalries. The foods we wanted to eat weren't available to us. The family patterns that we had back in Africa were no longer permitted. The religious practices we had back in Africa, those were stripped away from us. We were forced to speak English. But in spite of this, in spite of all these efforts to strip away black culture, many scholars such as Webb, Roy, and Saunders contend that elements of African cultures continue to survive in black American language, in our customs, our music, our folk tales, and our social organization. So even something how in black English, there's a tendency to use double negatives at times. But in many African languages, so that's considered grammatically incorrect in English. But in many African languages, those double negatives are allowed. So even something like that, has continued on in spite of great attempts to try and strip away the culture. This since you got an English professor and everything, I don't want to justify y'all using double negatives in y'all paper or nothing like that. But just to give you this history, I'll come to you in 1 second, Vince. Many people again contend that race no longer plays a role in American society. But again, the empirical data says something different. That black people make up just 13.6% of the U.S. population. In spite of these small numbers, we make up over 50% of all diagnosed cases of HIV. The rate among black men is 8 times that of white, and 2 times that of Hispanic men. And the rate for black women is 19 times that of white women and 4 times that of Hispanics. The average white family holds around $95,000 more in assets than the average black family does. Middle income white families have more assets. And again, assets is where it's at. Income is cool and everything, but you can lose your job today and boom, income is gone. You can't leave your children your income after you die. Assets, which can build wealth, you can. So this speaks of stock, bonds, business interests, real estate. So middle income white families have more than high income black families, because a lot of times we'll buy things like, cars and jewelry, shit that doesn't appreciate in value at all. And not saying that, if you want to get you a nice car, that's cool, but get you some assets first, dog. 72% of black mothers are unwed compared to 17% of Asians, 29% of whites, 53% of Hispanics, and 66% of Native Americans. Now, there's no perfect family structure per se. The best family structure is the type that raises good children. So there are many, many different ways of doing that. However, benefits are afforded in this society to two-parent households. Again, economics. So it helps just on a basic fundamental level to have 2 incomes. Hell, you need 3 incomes if you can help it. Many inner cities have schools where 50% of black, we talk about how important education is. But in places like Chicago, this is true in D.C., it's true in Baltimore, Atlanta, New York, etc. 50% of black men are dropping out of high school. I hope that you all do very well when you get out of college, but having a college degree in and of itself is not a guarantee. What the hell are you going to do when you drop out of the 10th grade? You better sell crack rock or have a wicked jump shot a lot of times. Again, these things are in my opinion, disproportionately affecting the black population at different rates. 1 out of 3 black men in this country are on prison, on parole, or probation. Willie Bush is continues to do an excellent job. Now, we talked about culture before, values, tradition, norms that are passed down from generation to generation. A concept in sociology is the culture of power. And this is the notion that some groups remain poor because they have certain cultural traits that make them more likely to be poor, and these traits are passed down from one generation to the next. Some of these traits include being less willing to save money, only focusing on the present and not preparing for the future, having more kids so you can afford out of wedlock, not valuing education, substance abuse, and suspicion of government and other mainstream institutions. Many politicians like Ronald Reagan has really profited politically off of these type of images, where he talks about the quote-unquote welfare queen, who he says, she has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and is collecting investment benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. And she's collecting Social Security on her card. She's got Medicaid, getting food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000.